Welcome to the latest edition of the Corner Booth Podcast here at the Snowden Delicatessen. I'm Aaron Rand, along with Bill Brownstein, Leslie Chesterman, and our special guest today, Liberal MP Anthony Housefather. Welcome.
That's great to be here.
And to mark your arrival here at the Snowden Deli, smoked meat sandwich, got the fries on the table. We're good to go. Some Danish for you as well, I think.
This is fantastic. This is a great restaurant in my riding.
Okay. So you've been here many times.
I have.
And understand you have a recommendation for those watching if they come here beyond the smoked meat.
I personally prefer the brisket. I think the brisket here is really good.
And the chicken soup.
The chicken soup is phenomenal. The chicken soup is good almost anywhere, but this chicken soup is especially good.
There you go. All right, listen, we're going to start by talking about what we have been talking about a lot lately, and that's this federal language bill that you've been involved in since the get-go. We had Marc Garneau as a guest a week ago. Marc Garneau famously said, for him, what was happening with this bill was the hill to die on. He walked away from politics. Obviously, you're not in the same situation as he is. But first of all, you've been in politics. You're the youngest looking 50-year-old I think I've ever met. How did you get into politics?
So I got into politics when I was a teenager, when the Charter of the French Language was amended by the Bourassa government to adopt Bill 86. Or no, not Bill 90. At that time, they didn't adopt Bill 86. Sorry. This was when they used the notwithstanding clause in 1989 to override the charter, right, and to ban English from commercial signs. And I got so angry that I got involved in the Federal Young Liberals. And then in 1994, I ran for town council in Hampstead, and I won, and I was the youngest councillor in Hampstead history. And got to learn so much, learning from Irving Edesky, who was the mayor at the time, and councillors like Barbara Steele and Lillian Weinberg and Jerry Kessner, David Sternthal. It was a blast. And I've been in politics ever since, fighting against the forced mergers, fighting for demerger, trying to be the best mayor of Côte Saint-Luc I could be, bringing in our aquatic and community center, bringing in composting across the city, and and one of Leslie's, I'm sure, favorites, we created the first urban agriculture program.
Oh, that's one.
In Quebec.
That really is amazing. Yep.
Yeah. And it was so important for people to have gardens behind their house and grow, food and
now they're all over the city, aren't they?
Amazing. Yes,
so
absolutely.
you were the first?
Yes.
Amazing. Wonderful. Congrats.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks. And then in 2015, I was elected a member of parliament when Erwin Kotler left. And now I'm the parliamentary secretary for public services and procurement. And I really love what I do. But Bill C-13, as Marc Garneau said, is a hill to die on.
And not such a blast for you now, because you're like the lone wolf, as it were. You're defending Anglo rights, going against your party, going against pretty much everybody else in government. What's the story there? I mean, do you feel like you're lost in the wilderness here? Or you feel like you have to speak up for the minority in Montreal? And it's also the Franco minorities, in fairness, in the rest of the country, too, that you're also advocating for.
So two things, Bill. One, I actually am screening a movie called Lone Wolves in Parliament on April the 18th.
I did not know this.
Well, that's fitting.
Which is a movie by a filmmaker named Blake Zeff in the United States about student debt. And he and Ari Melber from MSNBC are going to be moderating a panel with me and an NDP and Conservative MP about it. So Lone Wolf, I liked it. You gave me a chance to promo the film.
I had no idea.
But absolutely, one of my roles, this is one of the places where Francophones outside Quebec are not on our side. Francophones outside Quebec do not have the same effect as us when Bill 96 is mentioned. It doesn't bother them that the Charter of the French Language is being mentioned, or if it does, it doesn't preoccupy them to the extent that they want the bill to be stalled. So it's really a fight that we're having on our own, because there's a lot of things in the bill that do improve the rights of language minorities. It's the references to Law 96 that were originally in the bill, which were preoccupying, and then the added references that the Bloc and the Conservatives have brought in since then that make it worse. That has caused me to, have to intervene and fight as hard as I can for our community, because that's why I'm elected. If I didn't do that, I shouldn't be an MP, and I shouldn't be representing Mount Royal.
The Corner Booth Podcast is brought to you in part by the Snowden Delicatessen, where we are. 75 years in business, the hub of Montreal's greatest smoked meat, plus Carnotzel, potato latkes, and the famous Snowden Deli party sandwiches. That's the Snowden Delicatessen. How difficult is it? I mean, I've seen some of the interventions. There have been so many amendments to this proposed legislation. Do you not some days when you realize that there's very little you can actually get changed here, sort of sit back and go, why bother?
So that's a great question, and there are times that I feel that way, especially given the hundreds of amendments that the Conservatives and the Bloc have brought that all name Bill 101. So basically, we're just constantly fighting against amendments to add more references in the bill. But like I would say, I was able to, as soon as the bill came out, I gathered around me enough MPs from Quebec to work with me to convince the Prime Minister and our party caucus to remove the references to the Bill 101 that were originally in the bill, right? When we've had those amendments that have come to committee, the Liberals have voted with us to remove the two amendments we had, the two references that were there, and to reject all the new references. So at the very least, I was able to convince the people in my party that this wasn't a good idea to have references to Law 96 in the bill, even if I've been unable to convince the opposition, and I haven't succeeded at the larger level because the bill has gotten worse, not better. But at least I convinced those in my party, and that makes a difference. And if I hadn't been there, I don't think that would have happened.
So then what happened? I mean, look at your position right now. Your party is not, I mean, you walk into the room, what do? Do they turn it the other way? What's the story?
No. My party has voted with me.
But not in terms of like your defense of like C-13?
Yes, no, they have.
But not to the same extent.
No.
Well,
no. So what I've done
nobody's gone out on a limb like you have is my question.
So
the point.
It's two different things. People have followed me as opposed to and let me lead. They haven't exactly accompanied me the whole way.
Right.
But they voted with my position every time. And the difference, I think, is that I'm worried that in the end, people will just say the bill has been amended. It's not so good. We don't like the amendments, but we'll still support it. Whereas for me, like Mark, the references to Law 96 in the bill remains a major problem, and it is a hill to die on because the Quebec Charter of the French language should not be referenced in a federal bill, period.
But put it this way, come a federal election where the Liberal leader might want some support from Quebec, I don't think I think they're going to soften all of this to the extent where we're not going to hear a huge outpouring against C-13.
No, not an outpouring against C-13 because it was a liberal bill. And C-13 has a lot of good points.
They're going to keep it quiet.
Well, but C-13 has a lot of good points in it. Let's not get me wrong. There are things that improve the rights of language minority communities in C-13. The problem are these references that specifically harm services in English in Quebec.
Can you give some specific examples? Just because I think when people are listening, C-13, 96, blah, blah, just some specific examples about really what's in there that you want changed.
Well, the main thing is where you've now referred to the Charter of the French language, we've approvingly referenced a law that uses the notwithstanding clause. And as federal bureaucrats have said before the committee, the changes made by the Conservatives and the Bloc to the bill would have the effect of reducing English services in Quebec.
Right.
Because every service in Quebec is already provided in French.
Save for medical.
No, that's a Quebec service.
Okay.
What they basically said is, look, if you make this change, you already have all the services in Quebec provided in French. So all you're telling us is, by referring to the Charter of the French language, you've got to do some reduction of services in English. We don't know what that means. Does it mean that offices will offer services in English only certain hours? Does it mean that some offices that today offer services in English shouldn't anymore?
So you want more specifics?
No, I want those references removed so there's no ambiguity as to what the charter references are supposed to mean. They shouldn't be there. There's no need to refer to Quebec's law in a federal law because all it is being used to do is to say, well, you have to take into consideration Quebec's law. But what does that mean? Do we have to take into consideration, for example, that only people who have access to English schools should get services in English? Do we have to take into account that services or signs in French should somehow be bigger in French in Quebec than in English on federal signs, even though they're equal across the country? Nobody knows what these amendments from the Bloc and the Conservatives mean.
Yeah, and this historic Quebec Anglo situation is only going to go so far and only covers so many people because there are over 1 million people who identify as Anglophone here who are not under those conditions.
So there's in the Quebec law, there's about 1.2 million people that I say English is their first official language spoken. That's how the federal government counts an Anglophone. But provincially, what they're saying is you need access to English schools. So that means that there are even people who are mother tongue English speaking who don't have access to English schools because they didn't have parents or grandparents who went to school in English in Quebec. It's the worst, most limiting definition of the English speaking community possible.
Unless you're a CEO, of course, from a big international company.
Then you're exempt.
Then you're exempt.
Right. because and which is great. You want these international companies to come to Quebec, but why are people who live here who aren't part of the international community singled out for services not being allowed to be given that can be given to international people coming?
That's true.
What was the point of the federal government reopening this whole federal language policy to begin with? Why did that need to be done?
Yeah.
Oh, that's something because the Official Languages Act hasn't been amended for 30 years. And everybody wanted that. QCGN, all the English-speaking groups in Quebec, and the Francophone groups outside Quebec were all demanding it.
Not realizing what might happen when that happened.
I think that there was, on all sides, including in our own party, a lack of understanding of how much the Bloc, the Conservatives, and the NDP have now moved to another place when it comes to English rights in Quebec. I warned everybody that this I thought would happen because they all voted for Bill 101 to apply to federally regulated businesses several times in the House of Commons.
Right.
But I think naively, some people thought, well, this bill will just go ahead as the Liberals want it, even though we're a minority, and obviously that hasn't been the case.
So as this plays out, eventually this will get out of committee, ends up being voted on. What happens at that point?
So the federal government has the opportunity when it comes back to the House to move to amend the bill, to take out references that were put in at committee, but they would need a dancing partner. They would need the NDP, presumably, to say, we will set aside what our member at the committee did and vote in favor of changing the bill to remove these references to the Charter of the French language. And I don't know if that can happen, but I sure hope we'll try.
That's kind of a question of when someone hears, I hope that can happen, as an Anglo in Quebec, you're thinking, wait a sec, if that's the government's plan, that's not much of a plan.
Well, no, that, I mean, again, I can't speak for what the government's plan is. I'm just one MP, right? All I could say is I did get, along with some of my colleagues, the government to support our amendments to remove the Charter of the French language and to reject all the other ones that were adding it. So I think it's fair to say our position is we now agree the Charter shouldn't be referenced in the federal bill. But there's different, like I said, perspectives on how important that actually is. And if you're an English-speaking Quebecer, that's way more important to you than if you're not.
I'm thinking back to whenever Justin Trudeau was asked about this. He tends to give a pretty boilerplate answer. We understand there's a political motive to that. There's eventually going to be an election. But I wonder, people said, okay, with respect to, invoking the notwithstanding clause provincially into this bill, where does this end up? When I say end up, I mean beyond where it's going to be voted on in the House. Will there definitively be a Supreme Court challenge to this? Is that where we're going?
So, not to C-13, what there will be is a Supreme Court challenge that the federal government will support and be on side with on the issue that the preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause is not permitted under our Constitution. David Lametti stated that we would do this the minute that Bill 96 was adopted by Quebec. And that was something that I fought very hard for. And there's two options for that. One is the Bill 21 case, which is the case on, not allowing to use religious symbols in a lot of public professional jobs like prosecutor or judge or police. Teacher, and in public school. That is already before the Quebec Court of Appeals. To me, that is the best way to use the notwithstanding clause argument because they use the notwithstanding clause preemptively. That law would assuredly be struck down if they didn't use the notwithstanding clause because it violates freedom of religion. And you have people who have actually been harmed. And the Supreme Court, as opposed to getting a reference case where we just ask them questions, which is the other option, would actually have people who were harmed that were in front of them. They would see teachers wearing the hijab that lost their job or weren't allowed to get promoted. They would see men with turbans who couldn't be police officers. And the Supreme Court, I think, will be more sympathetic on the Bill 21 case with actual plaintiffs than just a question to them, which is the other federal government option. And people say, well, why didn't you do? I've heard Mr. Mulcair on your show many times saying, why didn't you just do a reference? It would have saved us 2 years. I'm worried because in the 80s, the Supreme Court allowed the preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause. So we'd be asking them to change their already established judgment from the 1980s. And I think it's easier when you have a story to tell. And when you have a narrative, than when you're just asking a fixed legal question. And so I've always supported doing this as part of the Bill 21 case. I think that is Minister Lametti's preferred position. And I think that will happen because the Court of Appeal...
But not before a federal election.
Oh, definitely before.
You think?
The Court of Appeal will be giving their judgment in this case.
Don't you think they're very leery about doing this and having this rejected?
No.
No?
Our position has been clear. We don't believe the preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause is constitutional.
I understand, but what would cost in terms of Quebec voters in a federal...
I don't think it would. I think the preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause is something that most Quebecers should be able to understand, and certainly those who vote Liberal should understand is wrong. Taking away people's rights without giving them the opportunity to contest the bill in court is wrong.
Yeah, although we both know the provincial government will take that, run with it, and say exactly the opposite. But that's fine. That's political.
Yeah.
With respect to you saying this will definitely happen before a federal election, there's some people thinking we may have a federal election in October.
Very soon.
I don't.
You don't?
I don't believe we will have a federal election until 2025.
Oh,
4 years
25.
after the last one. Yeah, October 2020. The last election was only October 2021, or no, September 2021.
You have some
I don't
insights
think we'll have an
versus
election
there,
for 4 years.
Anthony?
Sorry?
We're hearing much different stories. That's kind of interesting.
I don't see that there's any desire by either the Liberals or the NDP or even the Bloc to go to an election now.
What about the Conservatives?
Oh, I'm sure they want an election. I mean, they're in opposition. They have only every desire to have an election. But I don't believe, and if you look at this federal budget, it's not an election budget. I don't believe that it's a good budget, but it's not an election budget making promises wildly in every direction. I believe there's every intention
politicians do that? Make promises wildly in every direction to get votes?
I mean,
shocking.
I believe that you keep your promises, but I do believe that everybody knows election budgets look a little bit different than other ones.
Yes.
And I believe very strongly that this deal with the NDP will last until 2025.
Yeah, but that's a fly in the ointment, isn't it? You have a deal with the NDP, so you have a dental plan, they're on board. And I think it's actually pretty funny. Jagmeet Singh is spending the next week touring the country, patting himself on the back for allowing this to happen because, of course, that's how this coalition was put together. Well, what happens when pharmacare, for example, which was another part of this, is not introduced? Where is that down the line? Is there not a worry that the NDP can just one day get up and say, no, we've changed our mind?
Well, again, the NDP has no incentive to do that when they're where they are in the polls and where they are with money. I mean, I think, again, that dental care is something that's been in Liberal policy platforms as well. We've also, I mean...
But it took this coalition to actually put it in the budget.
Right. But it's a Liberal government, right? I mean, in the end result, what we've always said is that it's weird that we live in a country where you can get free medical services, but your teeth can go to hell. Or you live in a country where you have free medical services, but people can't afford to get their prescriptions, so they can't be healthy. And I think in the end result, we're going to need both a certain form of dental care, a certain form of pharmacare for those who are the most vulnerable. And that's what this provides.
The Corner Booth podcast is brought to you in part by Guaranteed Industries. 75 years in business, taking care of all your heating and air conditioning needs. And remember, they're a Lennox Premier dealer. Guaranteed Industries, residential, commercial, and industrial. 514-342-3400. Online, guaranteedindustries.com.
I want to go back to the language rights issue. You live in Montreal when you're not in Ottawa, correct?
Yeah, I live in Montreal. I never live in Ottawa. I'm in Ottawa the days the House sits.
Oh, you come here? Okay, sorry.
No,
better.
I stay there during the week, but
Right.
Montreal's always been my home.
Right. Well, the food's better too. So
100%.
I get in trouble.
And better critics also.
Yeah, exactly. But here's my question: you're living here, what has the French media's approach been to you and your opinions? And it's hard to live in a city because there's overwhelming French media, So how do you feel about the way they've treated you and your handling of this issue?
As someone defending Anglo rights.
Yeah, this is a
Mark
great.
Garneau certainly has had a lot of flack, so you must have had.
Yeah, no, this is a great question. I generally have a very good relationship with the French media on most issues. But definitely on this issue, I feel
You're
like
the villain. Do you feel like they're treating you like the villain?
Yes. I mean, in this one, whether it's the Sophie Durochers and Richard Martineaus of the world, or even people that you would think would be much more reasonable and much more temperate, I feel that myself, Mark Garneau, Patricia Latanzio, Emmanuel Lambropoulos have been vilified.
Yes.
And it was deeply hurtful to see the cartoons in La Presse and. But in the end result, you have to have a thick skin if you're a politician.
Right.
And I've gotten, I believe, overwhelming support from my constituents.
Yep.
And I'm standing up for my constituents, and that's my job.
Right.
But when you're attacked that way, and you know you're going to get that, right? You've already come to expect it. What are your answers when they accuse you of being anti-French or Quebec bashing? What's the comeback?
I'm not. I fully believe in the promotion of French. I support the promotion of French. I was the one who amended the Divorce Act a few years ago, along with my colleague Mona Fortier, to ensure that you had the right to divorce in French across Canada. You always had the ability to divorce in English in Quebec. I amended that act. The Broadcasting Act, I sat on the Canadian Heritage Committee. I was the one that put forward 9 amendments that enhanced the right of Francophone producers, original French productions across Canada. I strongly believe in supporting French culture and the French language in Canada, but it's not the minority Anglophones in Quebec who are overwhelmingly bilingual that are the threat to French. It's international forces, such as social media, that are entirely in English. And there's ways of combating that without reducing the rights of English-speaking Quebecers. And that's what I say all the time. The way I combated it is Mark Garneau and I wrote an op-ed for Le Devoir, and I wrote an op-ed in the National Post, and I will keep putting my ideas out there. I will go to committee, even though I don't sit on this committee, and fight for what I believe in. And if people want to attack me, I accept the attacks.
Now, is this a Quebec issue or is this a Montreal issue? Because it's a very different world in this province. Because you're a Montreal MP. So you are representing, you're my MP, it's true, although the area that you're in is far more Francophone, I believe, than it was when I was young, because I've always lived in, let's say, Mount Royal. Far more Francophone today than it was when I was young, but you also do have to represent your constituents. So,
right. So the riding in Mount Royal is one of the most Anglophone ridings in Quebec, in the sense that it's Côte Saint-Luc, Hampstead, Snowden, Côte-des-Neiges, TMR, but TMR itself has become more Francophone.
Yes.
It's about 60-40 now. But the riding is more English. I think in the end result, it doesn't matter to me. It's my principles. It's the fact that I represent both communities, and I don't believe you need to take away rights from one to support the other. And it's just an overall philosophical view. And when you ask, is it a Quebec issue, there's English-speaking minorities living across Quebec.
True.
We tend to think of the English-speaking minority in Montreal that has all the institutions we built over centuries, that's relatively well off. But there are English-speaking people living in Gaspé. Yep. There are English-speaking people living in Quebec, in the townships. Yep. And they do not have the services that we have. And so I feel that this argument is made for them as well, that they're the ones that are even more vulnerable, far more vulnerable than the English-speaking communities in Montreal, and they need every federal service to be given in their language. Like there are communities that are aging. Their young people are moving away to go to university in Montreal or elsewhere, and they don't replenish like we do by having immigration into the city. And it's a big concern. So I feel like it's a Quebec issue for English-speaking Quebecers, and it's certainly for Francophone Quebecers. They see it as a national issue as well.
The prevailing thought amongst many Anglophones is that they too seek protection for the French language, but they also feel that why is it important to suppress English to protect French? I mean, it's like two different situations entirely.
Right. Well, that's why 96 is so wrong, right? If you have services that are available in English from people who can give them in English, and let's look at, you want a marriage certificate, or you want a birth certificate, or a death certificate. It's basically pushing a button on the computer by the Quebec bureaucrat to give you English or French, but they said you can't get them anymore in English. Anybody. Then when services are available in sectors, you want tax services. Well, if you don't have access to English school, you won't get the tax services in English, even though they can easily provide it. That doesn't make any sense to me. And so it doesn't help any Francophone that you're doing either of these things. It only stops some people. It only publishes others.
Right.
Yeah.
I wonder too. There was a story, of course, this week. This got a lot of reaction. Actually, the CAQ now spending $87 million to conduct an online public consultation, not to ask whether people believe that there has been a decline in French, but the question is how to stop the decline in French. And I wonder, that's a political weapon this party's been using for a long time, letting us know that they believe, according to their science, that this is actually happening. Do you buy into that? Is there a decline of French in this province? And let's be honest to what Leslie said, in this city?
I mean, it depends how you define it, right? It's always a matter of how you define it.
That's a political answer.
No, but it's true. If you look at censuses, right, the number of mother tongue French-speaking people goes down, but so does the number of mother tongue English-speaking people go down, because you're replacing people with immigration. So these people who are immigrants are coming in speaking different languages, and instead of counting whether or not they're franchising, you're saying, well, they don't speak French as their first language or don't speak French at home, and saying, well, French is in decline. But there are more immigrants that gravitate toward French than has ever happened in Quebec history now. So, I think it depends on how you read it. People who are looking to say French is in decline can easily find ways to say that. But there's other indications that say it's not in decline.
There's another thing too, which is even if I identify as an Anglophone, I speak as much French as I do English. I work in French and English. We're not taking bilingualism enough into account, and a lot of my Anglophone friends who do not speak French very well or at all, for sure in Montreal, it's wrong to think that everybody here is bilingual. I would say all of them have sent their kids to French school. So we also have to look at the progression, the next generation, and stop ignoring bilingualism, because a lot of us are living our lives in two languages these days. We have to. We have to.
I agree 100%. I mean, I think, again, it's a question of what the end result you want is. If the end result is you want everybody in Quebec to be mother tongue French speaking or to use French in their private lives, that's one thing. And Legault's indication that he's looking at what language you're using at home as being an indication. I think the question is whether or not you're able to speak French in your public-facing life. Are you able to communicate in French at work? Are you able to communicate? And that question, more and more Quebecers are bilingual than ever before. More than 94% of Quebecers are bilingual, or not bilingual, speak French. So, again, I think that a lot of times we're looking for black when it's really very gray.
Right. And a lot of young Francophones want to speak English, and it's hard to tell them that it's not worthwhile.
I mean, again, I think everybody should be as bilingual as they can and speak as many languages as they can.
Right.
And I understand why Quebecers, French-speaking Quebecers and French-speaking Canadians across the country fear for their language and their future and their identity. And I think we as English-speaking Quebecers can identify with that because we have the same fears, not about the existence of our language, but about the existence of our community.
Right. Right.
What are your
I
constituents?
just want to ask one thing. Sorry. As far as you've been in politics now, it seems like for a long time. You got involved so young, but basically as a rookie not that long ago in federal politics, do you sometimes, I mean, given what you're going through right now with this debate in committee over this language bill, do you sometimes ever sit back and go, okay, I've done as much as I think I can do, and maybe it's time for me to go or do something else or fight a different fight somewhere else?
I mean, there's days that you get down because of all the attacks on you, and there's days that you feel isolated. But I believe, and I think my constituents believe, that I'm doing a good job, and I believe that you need a fighter there. And what is the answer? The answer for me to leave is somebody else who replace me who won't fight. I mean, most parties, and that's in every party, right? Their goal is to have people that want to go along with the party in every case. I'm not going to sit back on English-speaking rights or on minority rights of any kind. So no, I don't think that's the answer. Like that would be a terrible lesson, I think, to give to our kids, right? Okay, it's too difficult to fight for our rights, so let's just give up.
Well, and you replaced a fighter as MP in Mount Royal.
Right.
Erwin Kotler was also a big fighter for future
that's
rights.
in our history. It's Sheila Feinstein.
Yes,
if you remember correctly, Sheila Feinstein voted against the Meech Lake Accords in the House of Commons, voting against the position of her party.
Right.
Warren Allman voted against patriation of the Constitution because he didn't agree with the notwithstanding clause being added to the Charter. There have been MPs from English-speaking Quebec that have historically stood against the Liberal Party, even though we generally are Liberals. Yeah. On specific issues.
I didn't mean your example, to which I meant basically having to bang your head against that wall every day and realize you're not making any kind of advance at all.
But I do all the time. But I do all the time. I change the position of my party. I mean, all I can do is that. I fight within the party to change our position, and we did do that. That was good.
Yeah.
And on many other issues, right? I feel I make a significant difference. This is a hard one, but
okay. No, I'm
you
just
were
saying
the
down
mayor
the
of
road.
Côte Saint-Luc. You didn't have to be a boxer like you have to be today. So I'm wondering, like you say, you do represent your constituents. What kind of reaction do you get from them? Do they encourage you to keep fighting the good fight for yourself? What kind of feedback are you getting
on this issue? So I've always, I believe, been pretty close to my constituents because of all my years as a councillor and mayor and now 7 years as an MP. I think on this issue, I've gotten incredibly wide support, and I've had very little opposition from anybody. Like, I've only had 2 constituents, really. I'm sure there's many more that have actually reached out to my office saying they don't agree with what I'm doing. One of them being an English-speaking person who moved here from British Columbia, who says, but I moved here to be, when we should all be French here. I don't think most English-speaking Quebecers agree. And one Francophone from my riding who is a sovereignist and wouldn't ever support me on anything. But generally, the reaction has been people thanking me all over the place. Like, it's almost going back to the demerger fight, where I was the only elected councillor in my borough to support demerger. And at that time, I remember everybody coming up to me and thanking me and, and saying, thank you for speaking for me. I've been getting a lot of that from not only English-speaking people in my riding, but English-speaking people from across Quebec.
All right, we have to wrap up. I'll ask you the question we all, of course, have agreed needs to be asked, Anthony. Cavendish Boulevard extension. All right, let's have it. Spit it out. When is it happening?
So right now it's before the BAP. The main issue that's open is the Plante administration's vision of Cavendish is different than mine. They seem to want to have as few lanes as possible for traffic, and I believe you need to, in our world, be realistic. And the seniors in Côte Saint Luc and others who are commuting for work are driving cars. We don't have a metro. And the idea that you'd reduce Cavendish from 3 lanes to 1 lane for the extension to create a huge blockage makes no sense. So I believe we need to find the right design, get the approval of the railroads, but I believe, again, I've always supported Cavendish extension, that we're going to have it within our lifetimes. But well before that, I would say in the next 10 years, Cavendish will be complete.
Before the next federal election?
No.
Okay.
It wouldn't be, even if we started it tomorrow, the tenders wouldn't be finished before the election.
I want to thank you so much for being with us today.
Great pleasure.
Anthony Housefather, thank you so much. That's this edition of the Corner Podcast here at the Snowden Deli. We'll see you soon.